I think what a lot of us get, if we haven't experienced a disaster firsthand, or even peripherally, in terms of, okay, maybe you didn't lose your home, but you were in a disaster zone, right? If you haven't had that experience growing up, you might think, oh, a couple of months, maybe a year, we'll be back to normal, right? Things will be functional, we'll be back in our house. If you're experiencing from the outside, you're like, oh, yeah, those people need a few months, a year or two maybe to recover. No, recovery is a decade or more. Ronnie Schumann. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Emergency Management and Disaster Science at the University of North Texas. What that entails is I teach classes about disasters, about how we recover from disasters like tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, wildfires that impact our communities. I'm thinking a lot about ideas of how do we become more resilient as communities in the future. And so I translate that into my teaching. And that's what my research is all about too. So place attachment is, I think the best way to explain place attachment is this. Let me ask you a question. Why do you live where you live? You're probably thinking of a lot of reasons, right? There are definitely, okay, I've lived here all my life. I'm familiar with this place. I'm used to it. I have friends here. I have family here. So there are those social ties that we have to place. Could be we live where we live because we work nearby, or we have good schools, or we have access to healthcare. Over a period of time, we come to look at ourselves as locals. I, for instance, am born and raised in the New Orleans area, and my family goes back 300 years there, so there might be long-lived family ties to a place. You may own a house there. There may be a financial tie to that location. So all of these reasons, the answer to that question, why do I live where I live? That is place attachment. So the many ways that you can be connected to a location emotionally, functionally, and through your own identity. I think what a lot of us get, if we haven't experienced a disaster firsthand, or even peripherally, in terms of, okay, maybe you didn't lose your home, but you were in a disaster zone, right? If you haven't had that experience growing up, you might think, oh, a couple of months, maybe a year, we'll be back to normal. Right, things will be functional, we'll be back in our house. If you're experiencing from the outside, you're like, oh, yeah, those people need a few months, a year or two maybe to recover. No, recovery is a decade or more. That's what I think a lot of folks don't realize. Recovery is such a long road, and it is a very winding road, depending on the resources you have, the networks you have, access to financial resources, access to help, knowledge of how the system works. Communities, of course, recover quicker than households, and households recover quicker than the individuals in them. So that's another truth, right? A community might look back to normal, but I guarantee you there are people with less means who are not back to a functional level of recovery or a satisfactory level of where they were at before this disaster hit. It hits different. It hits harder for folks with less means. Growing up, I grew up in and around New Orleans. It's an area that has a lot of hazards, but in the middle of my undergrad, Hurricane Katrina happened. I was in school in Alabama at the time. My dad was working as a FEMA contractor at the time, doing damage assessments after some of the other hurricanes earlier that year. And he picked me up. We rolled back into town where my mom and sister were outside of New Orleans, and we spent the whole night before Katrina boarding up the house and caravanned out in our cars and didn't know if we would ever see our home again. And we went to Montgomery, Alabama, and it was about a week before we found out whether or not the house survived. So there was a period of unknowing. And I remember watching on TV the next morning and I couldn't believe my eyes. The place where I had grown up, it's all flooded. There's debris, there's people in need, there's people crying out for help there. I had family members and friends that were touched in far deeper ways and had to go through that process of recovery. I saw how difficult that was. I also, every time I went home didn't feel like home to me. The places that we would go and hang out were either clogged with debris or inaccessible, or there was no lighting, or they were unsafe. I tell you all of this to say, the idea of being attached to a place really resonated with me. I'm less interested in the weather. I'm more interested in how people experience hazards and disasters. And so that's what I do. I'm a social scientist. I'm a geographer. I ask questions about how people relate to place and make decisions based on those relationships. So that's what I was seeing, manifest in New Orleans and in Mississippi, is just this huge disparity between the way folks with means were able to recover and the way folks without means were not able to recover. So, before it's even a question of, do you want to move back to this place? There's the question of, are you able to? When wildfire happens, your home is destroyed, you have this decision to make. You basically have one of three choices. You can rebuild your home in the same place, in the same way as before, kind of recreating what you had before the fire. You can rebuild differently, maybe with fire-resistant materials, to acknowledge that there's a risk here. I'm going to do something differently this time, but I'm still going to reinvest in this community and stay here. Choice 3 is, I'm done with this place. It no longer satisfies my need. I'm going to move somewhere else. I'm going to relocate. So do you stay and rebuild as is? Do you rebuild differently there? Or do you relocate? And we heard a lot of different answers. So for the folks who decided to stay, a large part of the reason they stayed is because they had some kind of tie to that place. Oftentimes it was, an ancestral tie, a family tie. They'd grown up there and they felt like they wanted to raise a family there. Maybe they had relatives there that they're linking them to that place. But by and large, these people also were interested in investing in the future of that place. So for these folks, they were motivated to come back in that same location because of a desire to be part of a community that got it, a community that went through the same thing together and who understood one another. Many of the folks who decided to return to their same home sites and rebuild, whether in the same way or different, had this experience of being displaced temporarily. And we heard this common story again and again, like, okay, I left my community and tried living somewhere else, even temporarily. People didn't get it. People there hadn't gone through this fire. They were sympathetic to us, but they didn't truly get the trauma that we went through and this whole process of contemplation of what to do. The uncertainty, like I talked about in my experience, of not knowing whether things survived or what your home would look like in the future, what your community would look like in the future. If you went through a fire, you got it. But a lot of folks found in their temporary living situations away from their home communities, they got sympathy but not empathy. People didn't get it. People were ready to move on, right? They thought, a few months, clean up your debris, dust yourself off, get right back up. You'll be fine. Recovery wasn't done. So a lot of these folks who decided to stay made an intentional decision to come back and reinvest in their communities because of that shared experience of going through a disaster together and the desire to rebuild something better. I think we think about community support as support from friends, family, volunteer groups in the short term to clean up debris and help get that process going of restoring people to their communities, to their homes. In the more medium term, we're looking at gathering places. Where are people going for emotional support? Where are people going to satisfy basic needs? Where are they going to commune with each other, right? Because a lot of those essential places, your schools, your coffee shops, your libraries, where you might have organic groups form and you're encountering other friends and neighbors sharing stories of what happened, what is going on in your life, what your needs are, to be able to help one another. That happens at these gathering places that are often gone after a disaster.